The air raid sirens had fallen silent over Germany. It was May 1945, and American forces were sweeping through the ruins of the Third Reich, like archaeologists uncovering a lost civilization. But what they were about to discover would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about aviation. Captain Harold Watson stood at the edge of a forest clearing near Munich, staring at something that shouldn't exist. His hands trembled as he lowered his binoculars. Before him, partially hidden under camouflage netting and scattered pine branches, sat an aircraft that looked like it had fallen through a crack in time itself. "Sir, you need to see this," his lieutenant called out, his voice cracking with excitement and fear. The aircraft had no propeller. Its wings swept back at an aggressive angle, and twin turbines hung beneath them like predatory eyes. This wasn't just another German fighter. This was something else entirely, something that made America's best P-51 Mustangs look like museum pieces. Watson had flown combat missions over Europe for 2 years. He'd seen the best aircraft the Allied forces could build. He'd watched friends die in dogfights against German fighters. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. "Get intelligence on the phone," Watson ordered, unable to tear his eyes away from the sleek, angular beast before him. "Tell them we've found something. Something big." What Captain Watson didn't know was that he was standing in front of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. And within weeks, when American test pilots would strap themselves into its cockpit and fire up those revolutionary Junkers Jumo 004 engines, they would experience a terror that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with the horrifying realization that they had been fighting an enemy from the future. 3 weeks earlier, Colonel Marcus Hayes sat in a briefing room at Wright Field, Ohio, listening to a report that made his blood run cold. Intelligence had been filtering in from the European front fragmentary reports, intercepted radio chatter, and testimonies from captured Luftwaffe pilots. The reports all spoke of the same thing: German aircraft that flew without propellers, that could outrun anything the Allies had in the sky. "Gentlemen," Hayes addressed the room full of engineers and test pilots, "if these reports are accurate, we haven't just been fighting World War II. We've been fighting a war against technology we can't even comprehend yet." The room erupted in skeptical murmurs. Jet engines were theoretical, experimental at best. Everyone knew that. The British had their Gloucester Meteor, sure, but it was barely operational. The idea that Nazi Germany, a nation they were crushing under the combined weight of the Allied war machine, had somehow leapfrogged everyone else seemed impossible. But Hayes had seen the gun camera footage. A grainy film showed something streak past an American bomber formation at an impossible speed. No propeller blur, no engine cowling, just a gray dart that appeared, fired, and vanished before the bomber's gunners could even track it. "Our pilots," Hayes continued, his voice grave, "are reporting encounters with aircraft that accelerate past them like they're standing still." One B-17 crew described it as being attacked by a meteor. They said it came out of nowhere, moving so fast they thought their eyes were playing tricks on them. He paused, letting that sink in. The war in Europe is essentially over. But gentlemen, make no mistake, we need to find these aircraft. Because if we don't... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room understood the implications. If Germany had developed jet technology years ahead of the United States, what else had they created? What other scientific leaps had they made while America was still perfecting propeller-driven aircraft? The race was on. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, special teams fanned out with a single mission: find these jet aircraft, capture them intact, and get them back to America before the Soviets did the same. Back in that forest clearing near Munich, Captain Watson watched as his men carefully removed the camouflage netting from the Me-262. In the fading afternoon light, the aircraft seemed to gleam with an otherworldly quality. Its lines were all wrong, too smooth, too aggressive, too modern. "Captain!" one of his sergeants called out, climbing down from the cockpit. "You've got to see this. Watson climbed up and peered inside. The instrument panel looked like something from a science fiction novel. Gauges and dials he'd never seen before. Controls that made no sense. This wasn't just an advanced aircraft, it was a window into a future that hadn't arrived yet. But it was what the sergeant showed him next that made Watson's hands go cold. "Sir, look at this logbook we found in the pilot's compartment." Watson flipped through the pages, his German good enough to make out the operational dates. His eyes widened with each entry. This aircraft had been flying combat missions since 1944, almost a year ago. While American pilots were still dogfighting in propeller aircraft, German pilots had been flying jets. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks prior. The pilot had logged over 200 hours in the Me-262. 200 hours. This wasn't a prototype. This wasn't experimental. This was a fully operational, combat-proven, mass-produced jet fighter. How many of these did they build? Watson whispered to himself. The answer, which he would learn in the coming days, would terrify him even more than the aircraft itself. The Germans had produced over 1,400 Me-262 seconds, over 1,000 jet fighters. If Hitler had prioritized their production earlier, if he hadn't wasted resources on his doomed ground war in Russia, these aircraft could have changed everything. Watson looked up at the darkening sky, imagining what it must have been like for Allied bomber crews flying in their lumbering B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, doing maybe 180 miles per hour. Suddenly seeing these demons appear out of nowhere at over 500 miles per hour. No warning, no chance to evade. Just the flash of cannon fire and the screaming of jet engines. "Get this aircraft prepared for transport," Watson ordered, "and find me the German pilots. I want to know everything about how this thing flies." What Watson didn't know was that the German engineers and pilots they would capture in the following days would tell them something even more disturbing. The Me-262 wasn't the end of German jet development. It was just the beginning. In hidden facilities across Germany, Allied forces would soon discover designs for swept-wing jet fighters that looked like they belonged in the 1,950 seconds. Rocket-powered interceptors capable of climbing to 40,000 feet in under 3 minutes. Experimental aircraft that could fly faster than the speed of sound. Nazi Germany hadn't just been years ahead in jet technology. They had been exploring frontiers of aviation that American engineers hadn't even dreamed of yet. And in less than a month, when test pilot Harold Watson, no relation to Captain Watson, would finally get clearance to fly the captured Me-262 at Freeman Field, Indiana, he would experience 6 minutes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 6 minutes that would change American aviation forever. 6 minutes that would prove beyond any doubt that the United States had won World War II by the narrowest of margins, and only because Germany's revolutionary technology had arrived too late to matter. Freeman Field, Indiana, July 1945. Test pilot Harold Watson stood on the tarmac, staring at the Me-262 that had been painstakingly reassembled by American engineers. 2 months of work. 2 months of reverse engineering German technology that might as well have been carved from alien metal. Watson was one of the Army Air Force's best test pilots. He'd flown everything: experimental bombers, captured Japanese fighters, prototypes that barely held together. He'd survived engine failures, structural failures, and countless near-death experiences. But as he approached the Me-262 that morning, his mouth was dry and his hands were shaking. "You don't have to do this," Colonel Hayes said quietly, standing beside him. Watson forced a laugh. "Someone has to be the first American to fly this thing." "The Germans lost 5 pilots just learning how to operate it safely," Hayes reminded him. "And those were their best men, trained on the aircraft from the beginning. You're going in cold." Watson nodded. He'd read the reports. The Me-262 was a killer. Its engines were temperamental, prone to flaming out if you throttled them wrong. The aircraft had a tendency to snap into uncontrollable rolls at high speed. German pilots called it the Schwalbe the Swallow. Beautiful to watch, deadly to fly. But what terrified Watson most wasn't the danger. It was what this flight represented. If the Me-262 performed as reported, it meant American aviation technology was 5 to 10 years behind where they thought they were. It meant that every pilot who had died in the war had been flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy who had already entered the jet age. It meant that America's victory had been built on numbers and resources, not technological superiority. "Let's get this over with," Watson said, walking toward the aircraft. The cockpit was cramped and strange. Everything was labeled in German Kraftstoff for fuel, Geschwindigkeit for airspeed, Höhe for altitude. Watson had spent 3 days memorizing the controls with captured German manuals and a translator sitting beside him. Now, alone in the cockpit, those lessons felt inadequate. He went through the startup procedure with methodical precision. The Jumo 004 turbojets required a complex startup sequence. Too much fuel, and they'd flood. Too little, and they wouldn't fire. Get the throttle timing wrong, and the turbine blades would overheat and disintegrate, turning the engines into bombs strapped to your wings. Watson pressed the starter button for the starboard engine. Nothing. He checked the fuel mixture, adjusted the throttle, and tried again. This time, the engine coughed to life, with a sound unlike anything Watson had ever heard. Not the familiar roar of a piston engine and propeller, but a high-pitched whine that rose to a shriek. The aircraft trembled as the turbine spooled up, and Watson could feel the raw power vibrating through the airframe. He started the port engine. Now both jets were screaming, and the Me-262 felt alive beneath him, a predator straining against its leash. Watson released the brakes and began to taxi. The first thing he noticed was how blind he was. The long nose of the Me-262 blocked his forward view on the ground. He had to weave back and forth just to see where he was going, a technique called S-turning that felt dangerous and wrong. He reached the end of the runway, ran through his final checks, and pushed the throttles forward. The acceleration was violent. Watson's head slammed back against the headrest as the Me-262 leaped forward like a rocket. In his years of flying, he'd never experienced anything like it. His P-51 Mustang was fast, but its acceleration was smooth, gradual. The Me-262 attacked the air, tearing through it with a fury that was almost angry. 50 miles per hour, 70, 100. The tail came up, and suddenly Watson could see the runway ahead. The needle was still climbing. 120, 140. He pulled back on the stick, and the Me-262 jumped into the sky. For 5 seconds, Harold Watson felt like a god. The ground fell away beneath him at an impossible rate. The Me-262 climbed at nearly 4,000 feet per minute, twice the rate of his P-51. The controls were responsive, light, almost too sensitive. The slightest input sent the aircraft banking or pitching. And then, reality hit him. At 2,000 feet, the starboard engine hiccuped. The whine stuttered, dropped in pitch, and Watson's heart stopped. The German manuals had warned about this. The Jumo 004 engines were unreliable, prone to surging and flaming out without warning. Watson eased back on the throttle, babying the engine back to stable operation. His hands were sweating inside his gloves. One engine failure he could handle, but if both engines quit, the Me-262 had the glide characteristics of a brick. He leveled off at 10,000 feet and tried to calm his racing pulse. Below him, Freeman Field looked like a toy model. He'd climbed higher in 2 minutes than it usually took him 10. Freeman Field, this is Watson. I'm at Angels 10 and stable. Beginning test maneuvers. Roger, Watson. We've got you on radar. How does she handle? Watson paused, searching for words. Like nothing I've ever flown before, he finally said. It's fast, really fast, but it feels wrong, like the aircraft is fighting me. He pushed the stick forward and dove. The airspeed indicator spun upward. 300 miles per hour. 350. 400. Watson's vision began to tunnel. The G-forces pressed him into his seat. The control stick grew heavier in his hands. Compressibility effects that American aircraft didn't experience at these speeds. 450 miles per hour. At this velocity, Watson was flying faster than any American aircraft in the inventory could go in level flight. He was in uncharted territory, experiencing aerodynamic forces that American test pilots had only theorized about. 500 miles per hour. The Me-262 began to shake. The controls went mushy, unresponsive. Watson pulled back on the stick, trying to level out, and the aircraft ignored him. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Come on." The ground was getting closer. Watson could see individual trees now. Roads. Buildings. He pulled harder, using both hands on the stick. Finally, grudgingly, the Me-262 responded. The nose came up. The shaking smoothed out. Watson leveled off at 3,000 feet, his heart hammering in his chest. "Watson, report status." The radio crackled with urgent concern. "I'm okay," Watson gasped. "But I just experienced something I've never felt before. At high speed, the aircraft becomes unstable. The controls don't respond properly. It's like flying into a wall of invisible resistance." What Watson had just experienced was transonic flight, the edge of the sound barrier. American aeronautical engineers were still trying to understand the physics of what happened when aircraft approached the speed of sound. The Germans had already encountered these problems and partially solved them with the Me-262's swept-wing design. But Watson didn't know that yet. All he knew was that he'd just flown faster than any American pilot in history, and it had nearly killed him. He spent the next 20 minutes putting the Me-262 through its paces. He executed rolls. The aircraft snapped through them with dizzying speed. He tried tight turns. The Me-262 hemorrhaged energy in turns, its high wing loading making it sluggish compared to propeller fighters. But in straight-line speed, nothing could touch it. Watson pushed the throttles forward and watched the airspeed climb past 520 miles per hour, over 100 miles per hour faster than the top speed of a P-51 Mustang. At that speed, Watson realized with cold clarity, no Allied fighter could catch the Me-262. Not in a dive, not in level flight, not in a climb. If a German pilot in a Me-262 wanted to run away, there was nothing an American pilot could do about it. And if that German pilot wanted to attack, Watson imagined being in a B-17, lumbering along at 180 miles per hour, and seeing one of these jets materialize out of the sun at 500 miles per hour. By the time the gunners tracked it, it would already be past them. One pass, maybe two, and then gone before the fighter escort could react. It was a nightmare scenario, and it explained why so many bomber crews had come back from raids over Germany with stories of phantom aircraft fighters that appeared and disappeared like ghosts, too fast to track, too fast to shoot down. "Freeman Field, I'm coming in for landing," Watson radioed. "Fuel is getting low." "Roger. Good luck, Watson." He'd need it. Landing the Me-262 was the most terrifying experience of Watson's life. The aircraft wanted to land fast, too fast. The Germans recommended touchdown at 110 miles per hour, which was faster than many American fighters cruised. The narrow landing gear and tricycle configuration made the aircraft unstable on the ground. Watson lined up on final approach, fighting to keep the nose down and the speed up. Too slow. And the Me-262 would stall and drop like a stone. Too fast and he'd overshoot the runway. He crossed the threshold, pulled the throttles to idle, and felt the aircraft begin to drop. The runway rushed up at him. Watson flared too much, and the Me-262 ballooned back into the air. Damn it! He pushed forward, killed the lift, and the aircraft slammed onto the runway with a bone-jarring impact. The landing gear screamed. Watson stood on the brakes, fighting to keep the aircraft straight as it tried to weather vane in the crosswind. The Me-262 finally rolled to a stop with less than 500 feet of runway remaining. Watson sat in the cockpit for a full minute, his hands shaking, his flight suit soaked with sweat. He'd survived. Barely. When he finally climbed down from the cockpit, Colonel Hayes was waiting. "Well?" Hayes asked. Watson pulled off his helmet and looked back at the Me-262. In the afternoon sun, It looked almost beautiful, sleek, modern, deadly. "We're in trouble," Watson said quietly. "That aircraft is 5 years ahead of anything we have, maybe 10. If the Germans had deployed these in 1943 instead of 1944, if they'd built 5,000 instead of 1,000. He didn't finish the sentence. Hayes nodded grimly. "I'll inform Washington. We need to accelerate our jet program immediately. If the Soviets capture this technology." He let the implication hang in the air. Watson looked up at the sky, imagining a future where jet fighters were the norm, where propeller aircraft were obsolete relics. That future had arrived faster than anyone expected, and America was racing to catch up. Wright Field, Ohio, August 1945. Dr. Robert Kessler stood in a hangar surrounded by the disassembled remains of 3 captured Me-262s. Engines lay on workbenches like dissected alien organisms. Wing sections hung from cables. Instrument panels were spread across tables, each gauge and switch labeled with hastily scribbled notes. Kessler was America's leading aeronautical engineer. He designed components for the P-38 Lightning and consulted on the B-29 Superfortress. He'd seen the cutting edge of American aviation technology. But as he examined the Me-262's Jumo 004 turbojet engine, his hands trembled. "This shouldn't be possible," he whispered. His assistant, a young engineer named Tom Chen, looked up from the turbine blades he was measuring. "Sir?" "These engines," Kessler said, holding up a turbine blade that gleamed in the harsh fluorescent light. "They're made from stamped sheet metal, not forged alloys like we use, not precision-machined components. Stamped, sheet, metal." Chen frowned. "That's impossible. A jet engine operates at temperatures that would melt—" "I know what it should do," Kessler interrupted, "but look at this." He pointed to the blade's coating. "They've developed some kind of ceramic thermal barrier, and the combustion chamber uses a revolutionary cooling design that cycles air through hollow passages in the metal. It's crude, it's unreliable, and it shouldn't work for more than 25 hours before requiring a complete rebuild. But it does work," Chen said quietly. "Yes," Kessler nodded, the reality sinking in. "It works well enough to put a jet fighter into mass production while we're still drawing blueprints for experimental prototypes." What disturbed Kessler most wasn't the sophistication of German engineering. It was the desperate ingenuity. These engines were designed for a nation running out of resources. No chromium for high-temperature alloys. No nickel for corrosion resistance. Just steel, aluminum, and brilliant improvisation. The Germans had built jet engines from scraps and made them fly. Over the next week, the engineering team uncovered revelation after revelation. The swept-wing design wasn't just aesthetic, it was a solution to high-speed flight stability that American engineers hadn't even identified as a problem yet. When Watson had experienced control issues at 500 miles per hour, he'd encountered shock waves forming on the wings. The Me-262's swept wings delayed the formation of those shock waves, pushing the aircraft's effective speed envelope higher. "They knew," Kessler told Colonel Hayes during a briefing. "The Germans knew about transonic aerodynamics. They'd already encountered the sound barrier problem and partially solved it." Hayes leaned forward. "How far ahead are they?" Kessler pulled out a folder containing captured German documents. "We found these at a research facility near Bavaria. Designs for swept-wing aircraft that look like something from the 1960s. Blueprints for rocket interceptors capable of Mach 2. Studies on supersonic flight characteristics." He spread the documents across the table. One showed a sleek, delta-winged aircraft that looked nothing like anything flying in 1945. Another detailed a rocket plane designed to climb to 50,000 feet, destroy a bomber formation, and glide back to Earth. "They were 10 years ahead of us," Kessler said flatly. "Maybe 15 in some areas." The room fell silent. "What stopped them?" someone finally asked. Kessler's expression darkened. "Resources, time, and Hitler's interference." The Führer initially wanted the Me-262 developed as a bomber, not a fighter. That delayed its deployment by nearly a year. If it had entered service in 1943 as a pure interceptor, he didn't need to finish. Everyone in the room understood. The Me-262 could have devastated Allied bombing campaigns. It could have extended the war. It could have changed history. But there was a darker truth that Kessler discovered, one that made him physically ill. In a storage room buried among technical manuals, he found production records from the underground factories where Me-262 seconds had been assembled. The documents revealed that much of the aircraft's construction had been done by slave labor concentration camp prisoners working in horrific conditions in bomb-proof tunnels. Thousands had died building these technological marvels. Kessler stared at the production numbers, at the efficiency metrics, at the cold, bureaucratic language describing human beings as units of labor. The Me-262 represented both the pinnacle of engineering achievement and the depths of human cruelty. "Sir?" Chen stood in the doorway holding another document. "You need to see this." It was a memo from a captured German engineer, written just weeks before the war ended. In it, the engineer described the next generation of projects. Jet bombers, capable of reaching New York, intercontinental missiles, even theoretical studies on nuclear-powered aircraft. "They weren't just ahead of us," Chen said quietly. "They were imagining technologies we haven't even dreamed of yet." Kessler nodded slowly. The Nazi regime had been evil. Its goals, monstrous, but it had also channeled enormous resources into scientific advancement, creating a technological ecosystem that had leapfrogged the rest of the world. And now, that knowledge was America's. Hayes called a meeting with the engineering team 3 days later. His expression was grave. "Gentlemen, I've just returned from Washington. The President has approved Operation Paperclip, a program to bring German scientists and engineers to America. We're going to offer immunity and employment to the very people who built weapons for the Nazi regime." The room erupted in angry protests, but Hayes held up his hand. "I don't like it either, but the Soviets are doing the same thing. Right now, there's a race happening across Germany. Both sides are grabbing scientists, documents, and technology as fast as they can. If we don't secure this knowledge, the Soviets will. And the next war, and there will be a next war, will be fought with jet aircraft, rockets, and weapons we can't even imagine yet." Kessler stood up. "What about the Me-262 program? What are your orders?" Hayes looked at each man in turn. "Strip every secret from these aircraft. Learn everything. Then, use that knowledge to build something better. The Army Air Force wants American jet fighters in production within 2 years. Fighters that can match or exceed the Me-262's capabilities." "2 years?" someone exclaimed. "That's impossible." "So was what the Germans did. They built a jet fighter program from scratch in the middle of a war, with bombers destroying their factories and resources running out. We have peace, unlimited resources, and the greatest industrial capacity in the world. If they could do it, so can we." He pulled out photographs of Soviet forces in Berlin, of Russian soldiers examining captured German aircraft. "The war with Germany is over, but the next conflict is already beginning, and whoever masters jet technology first will control the skies for the next 50 years. 6 months later, March 1946. The first American jet fighter, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, sat on the runway at Muroc Army Airfield in California. Its design incorporated lessons learned from the Me-262. A streamlined fuselage, carefully positioned engine intakes, and a tricycle landing gear. But as test pilot Tony LaVere prepared for its first flight, everyone knew the truth. Without the Me-262, the P-80 would have taken years longer to develop. The Germans had given America a blueprint for the future. "We're cheating," LaVere said to his crew chief. "We're standing on German shoulders. "Better than letting the Russians stand there instead," the chief replied. He was right. Intelligence reports from occupied Germany painted a disturbing picture. Soviet forces had captured the underground factories where Mi-262 seconds had been built. They'd seized thousands of documents. And most importantly, they'd recruited German engineers and forced them east. The Cold War had begun, and it would be fought with technology that both sides had stolen from Nazi Germany. In Moscow, captured German engineers were already at work designing jet fighters for the Soviet Air Force. The MiG-15, which would terrorize American pilots over Korea just 4 years later, incorporated swept-wing technology directly derived from German research. In America, Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 German scientists and engineers, including Werner von Braun, who would later design the rockets that put Americans on the moon. The moral compromise was staggering. Men who had worked for the Nazi regime, who had used slave labor, who had built weapons to destroy Allied cities, were now American citizens with security clearances. But the geopolitical calculus was brutal and simple. If America didn't take them, the Soviets would. The Mi-262 had opened Pandora's box. The secrets it revealed: swept wings, high-speed aerodynamics, jet propulsion, advanced metallurgy, couldn't be forgotten. Both superpowers now raced to exploit that knowledge, to push aviation technology beyond what the Germans had achieved. Harold Watson never flew the Mi-262 again after that first terrifying test flight. But he went on to test the P-80, the F-86 Sabre, and eventually became a consultant on supersonic aircraft development. He flew planes that broke the sound barrier, planes that could fly at 1,000 miles per hour, planes that would have been considered science fiction just 10 years earlier. But he never forgot those 6 minutes in the Mi-262. It was like peering through a window into the future, he told an interviewer in 1972. And realizing that the future was already here, we just didn't know it yet. The Germans had jumped ahead by a decade, and we spent the next 10 years running to catch up. In the late 1940 seconds and early 1950 seconds, American aviation exploded with innovation. The F-86 Sabre, with its swept wings copied from German research, dominated the skies over Korea. The B-47 Stratojet, a 6-engine swept-wing jet bomber, revolutionized strategic warfare. And the X-1, flown by Chuck Yeager, finally broke the sound barrier in 1947 using data gleaned from German wind tunnel tests. Every one of these aircraft owed a debt to the Mi-262. Dr. Robert Kessler eventually became head of aeronautical research at what would become NASA. Before he died in 1968, he gave an interview about the Mi-262 program. "We like to think of technological progress as steady and inevitable," he said. "But the truth is messier. Sometimes evil regimes, driven by desperation and unlimited ambition, push technology forward in ways that peaceful societies don't. The Nazis did monstrous things. But they also created scientific knowledge that couldn't be undiscovered." He paused, his aged hands trembling slightly. The Mi-262 taught us that America couldn't afford to be complacent. We'd won World War II with brave men flying good aircraft. But good wasn't going to be enough anymore. The next war would be won by whoever mastered jet technology, rocket technology, and eventually nuclear technology. The Mi-262 was our wake-up call, and we answered it. Today, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum houses a restored Mi-262. Visitors walk past it every day, admiring its sleek lines, reading the placard that describes it as the world's first operational jet fighter. But most don't understand what they're looking at. They don't know that this aircraft represented a technological leap that shocked American engineers. They don't know about Watson's white-knuckle test flight, or Kessler's revelation that America was 10 years behind, or the desperate race to catch up that defined the early Cold War. The Mi-262 was more than just an aircraft. It was proof that technology could advance in sudden, revolutionary leaps. It was evidence that America's victory in World War II had been closer than anyone wanted to admit. And it was a reminder that scientific knowledge, once created, belongs to whoever can seize it. When the United States tested that captured Me 262 inches, 1,945, they realized three terrifying truths. First, that Nazi Germany had been years ahead in aviation technology, and had they deployed it earlier, the war might have ended very differently. Second, that the next global conflict would be fought with jets, rockets, and weapons of unimaginable power. And third, that the race to control that technology had already begun, and falling behind could mean losing everything. The Me 262 didn't just fly into American history. It catapulted American aviation into the jet age, sparked the Cold War arms race, and proved that in the modern world, technological superiority could matter more than courage, numbers, or even righteousness. And it all started with one captured aircraft, hidden under camouflage netting in a German forest, waiting to reveal its secrets to a world that wasn't ready for them.